Hello, my name is Jo. Today we are going to talk about having an internal dialogue versus not having an internal dialogue, how that relates to language learning, and how different people actually think. So I don't know if you've seen it, but occasionally a discussion makes the rounds online about having an internal dialogue. Apparently, some people do, some people don't, and it seems like most people don't know about the other type of person until this discussion happens online. From what I understand, some people have a consistent running monologue in their minds. To some extent or another, it could be nearly constant or it could be occasional, kind of narrating their thoughts or what's going on, similar to what you'd see in a movie or a TV show when the main character is narrating things in their mind. And some people do not have that at all. Mostly from the non-internal dialogue people who find this out, I saw a lot of responses that were like, oh, this makes so much sense now. I wondered, why they portrayed it that way in movies, or I'm always so confused about XYZ. Whereas from the internal dialogue people, there's generally a freak out of, wait a minute, your minds are just silent? Which I don't think is necessarily true, but it is pretty funny. From there, I have seen some, but less discussion about whether or not people actually think in words versus having their thoughts in kind of other forms. And that's actually something that I have a lot more interest in. So we're just kind of going to talk about both of these things. So for me personally, I do not have an internal dialogue really at all. And I also do not generally think in words. Generally, I only think in words if I am thinking of how I would express something in words. So if I am preparing to write something or say something, I'm going to be thinking in words. If I'm thinking about how I would win an argument that happened 3 hours ago, I'm thinking in words. But otherwise, I would call my thoughts more like concepts. The best way that I can think of to describe it is like if you have forgotten the word for something, it's not that you don't know what that is. You still know what it is in your mind. You just don't have a word attached to it. So like if you're trying to think of the word for spatula, it's not like you don't know what a spatula is. You just haven't thought of the particular word for it. And I would say that's the closest description I can think of. I'm not searching for the word, so it's not a great description, but it's just kind of like I just am skipping past the word for the thing and just directly associating with the thing. But that's just me personally. I know a lot of people think more so in imagery or in sounds or all kinds of different things. And that's something that I find super interesting, particularly as it relates to language learning, if it relates at all. So I started asking all of the people that I'm close to in my life and my Instagram followers whether they think in words or not and whether they have an internal dialogue or not. Based on the Instagram polling that I have done, which is actually at 2 different points about a year apart, I think about 2/3 of my followers think in words and about 1/3 think in any other thing. Obviously, that's not a meaningful sample, but it is interesting data regardless, and I think it seems sort of on par with what I've seen when I actually talked to people. The majority of people do seem to think in words, and they seem to struggle to understand how other people could think in anything else. There has been one small study that I could find about specifically internal monologues, and honestly, I don't feel like the questions that they asked are super suited to what I'm curious about, but they found that it varies extremely widely among people. Some people never experience internal narration, some people experience it nearly all the time. The median was apparently internal monologue occurring about 20% of the time, and that researcher estimates that about 30 to 50% of people experience an internal monologue. I do feel like based on the internet's reaction that has to be at least 50%, if not more, because it seems like most people are shocked that people don't have internal monologue, not vice versa, but that could just be the most surprised people expressing their opinion. But back to language learning, I've been thinking on and off for several months about how this could affect language learning. So I posted on Reddit, and I reached out to my Instagram followers and also some content creators that make content about language learning. I got a lot of silence as expected, but also some really, really great responses. Primarily, I was curious as to whether language learners are more likely to be one way or the other, and what the advantages and disadvantages of each would be. My hypothesis going into this was that most people think in words and have an internal dialogue, at least to some extent, and that there was kind of one major advantage / disadvantage for each type. So word thinkers, particularly those within internal monologue, have a built-in opportunity to practice because their thoughts are happening in words, and so they can use those thoughts to think in their target language. Plus, as a side bonus, it would be a very, very cool sign of progress when you naturally start thinking or having an internal monologue in your target language. So that would be a side bonus as well. The major advantage that I could see for not word thinkers is that we might have an easier time forming connections to foreign words because our ways of thinking are not as strongly tied to our native language. And similarly, we wouldn't have to be as concerned about always having the thought first in our native language and then translating it, although I think that stops happening with people who think in words also. And then the disadvantages would just be the reverse of those things. Less opportunity to practice for people who don't have an internal monologue, and potentially a harder time making those connections for people who think strongly in words. Now, unfortunately, we heard from not a single other person who does not think in words. So I guess I will be the lone representative. But I did hear from a lot of people who think in words and have an internal monologue. So I do think that the percentage of that is probably 2/3 or higher. But the primary thing I heard from people who do think in words was how much practice they get from actively thinking in another language. I did figure this would be the case, as I said, but I really didn't expect how strongly everyone felt like it had an impact on their learning. Cilli at Cilli Studies said, "I think in words all the time, and when I actively try to think in one of my target languages, then it first of all is good practice because you can really take the time to put your sentence together, and it can also be a good way to track your progress. Over time, you'll notice that the gaps you fill in with your native language become smaller and smaller." Tyler said, "For me, thinking in my target language has been an essential part of the process for me. From the very beginning of my Spanish learning journey, I started translating my inner dialogue into Spanish so that I could think to myself in that new language. This was a great way to make the foreign language feel more personal, and it helped me utilize it on a daily basis, even though I didn't have anyone at the time to practice with. I also think it's a great way at developing your voice in a new language, as I feel like my personality is slightly different in Spanish than in English. Thinking in Spanish has helped build my confidence in the language for sure." Julianne at Leafling Learns said, "I'm very much in the near constant internal dialogue camp, so I guess when I'm doing language learning things, I'm hearing a lot of the language in my own voice, though it's quite good at mimicking others, which I think is a positive. Can get a bit annoying to get a completely random Japanese phrase stuck in my head, like getting a song stuck in your head, but more boring, because my brain will just say it at random." And then Christian sent a voice memo.
Me personally, sometimes I have the internal monologue moments. Other times I'm just in the moment. I'm not thinking about anything. I'm just wherever. I'm doing the task or I'm just zoning out. You know what I'm saying? So I'm not on either side of the other. But as far as language learning goes, I think it's helpful. Yeah, I constantly think about, for example, let's say I'm going in my refrigerator, I'm taking out some food. I would think, how do I say I'm going to take out food in Spanish? That's just an example. And I constantly do that. Like, if I recognize I don't know how to say it in my second language or third language, I'll look it up, So that's where I think it's helpful. So that's my opinion on it.
I think this is really telling because prior to hearing all of these, I was kind of thinking maybe it's not that big of an advantage because I can do that too. I can think in words if it's a context that requires it or if I actively choose to, I can think in words anytime I want. So I was like, well, it's not that big of an advantage because I could choose to do this too. But I think the thing that I wasn't taking into account is that my default is so strongly to not think in words that I don't, like that sounds dumb, but it's not something I think of to do because my mental paradigm is not to be narrating what I'm doing. So to actively try to do that in another language would be a much bigger mental hurdle, which means I'm not going to do it as often. I'm not going to think of it, like what Christian was saying there. I very rarely experience that kind of thing where I would be doing something and I would think, now I am making myself a sandwich or whatever. That's just not something that typically happens to me. So I would have to be like, okay, for the next half an hour, I'm going to try to narrate what I'm doing in my target language. And I certainly could do that, but it seems like it's fairly seamless for people who naturally have an internal dialogue, and it's not for me. So I do think that that is very, very interesting. Now, I'm not sure whether I want to try to do that because honestly, I do not want an internal dialogue at all. And so I'm a little bit almost afraid that I would kind of train myself into narrating, and I don't want to do that. But I do think that I will try to incorporate it a little bit more. But it is kind of funny to think about, like, how much do I really want to try to retrain my brain that way? Because something that I see a lot of people online talk about is how quiet and peaceful the brain must be if you don't have an internal dialogue. And I don't think that that's true. My brain is very chaotic at all times. But it's just kind of loosely chaotic, I do not think that I want myself rambling to myself in my head 24/7, but I guess since I am here to be the lone representative from the not thinking in words camp, I will just talk about what I guess my experience has been. And again, this is something that, like all of us, none of us can really know what the other experience is like because we only have our own experience. But I would say the thing that I have seen just talking to other people and watching other people learn languages is that I do genuinely think that if you don't think in words, your brain is slightly more adaptable to making conceptual connections and less kind of comfort bound to your native language, if that makes sense. I don't necessarily need to replace the English word for an object with a Spanish or French word for the object because the object already exists in my mind very firmly as its own entity, and it's more of like, instead of the object with an English label slapped over it, it's more so I have the object and then a sub-entity, which is the English word for it, and all I have to do is add another sub-entity, which is another language's word for it. And obviously it's not that easy, it's not like I just immediately remember all vocabulary, because I absolutely do not. But I do think that is probably the biggest potential advantage from this viewpoint. So I don't think that there's any really advice or takeaways from this. I just really find this such an interesting topic and discussion, and I would love to continue it in the comments. If any of you have thoughts or experiences or opinions, definitely leave them below and we can continue the discussion. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.